Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and in our last video we got our jump up and running. And it's actually a pretty good jump, yet the character looks stiff. We need to add some animations. And we're not just gonna animate him for walking, idling, and jumping, we're gonna add some advanced animations for rising, falling, and landing as well. We'll break this video into 3 parts. The first part will create our animations. In part 2, we'll set up our animator to transition between them. And finally, we'll write the code that actually gets those animations running at the right time. That's where we're headed in this video. Let's get started. Now, step 1 is creating the animations themselves. So I'm just gonna come down to my animation pane and I'm gonna drag it up here so that I can see my sprites down below and handle the animations up top here. If you don't have this window yet, you can go up top to Window, Animation, and Animation to find it. All right, at this point, it's really important that you click on the sprite, not the player, as we want our animations to live on a separate object from our physics. You can then come down and hit Create, and just in our Assets folder, I've already created an Animations folder. If you've not done that, I would suggest doing it now. Let's call this first one Idle. Next up, we just want to find our character sprite sheet. In the first video in the series, we got our sprite sheets all sliced up. That said, I've got 2 of them, so I'm just gonna quickly slice the second one, and if you missed that first video, you can follow along here. First thing we need to do is set our pixels per unit. For filter mode, we want point no filter, and to preserve color fidelity, we're gonna change our format to RGBA 32-bit. You can then hit apply and open up the sprite editor. Here, we're just gonna click slice, and rather than using automatic, we wanna slice by grid size. I'm using 56 by 56. We can slice that up, hit apply. Now when you click on the little play button here on your character sprite sheet, you should now be able to see them all as individual files. When I look up close, I can see that number 0 through to 5 are my idling, so I'm just gonna shift click all of those at once and drag them in here. We can hit play to see how that's looking, and it's not bad, but it's a little fast. I'm just gonna turn off my gizmos here so I can see what's going on, and also expand the animation window a little bit just to give us more room to work. At this point, you can click and drag all of your animation in order to make this take place over a longer period of time. Now when I hit play, it's looking a lot better, but it's just a little bit off. There's something kind of catching a little bit. What's going on here is currently each of these frames is lasting for about 9 frames, except for the very last one, which plays for exactly 1 frame and then resets back to the beginning. To fix that, I'm just gonna grab a copy of this first one, and then I'll just paste an extra copy of it here at the end. There we go. Now we've got a nice smooth looking idle animation. All right, we can just click on the idle animation here in order to create a new one. We're gonna make walking next. And if you're using Brullov's generic pack, this one is actually on the second sprite sheet. My walk animation is 10 frames long, so I'm just gonna shift click those and drag them up. And once again, this is gonna be a looping animation, so I just wanna make a copy of that first frame and paste it in at the end. At this point, I can expand it once again. I'm gonna do mine over about 1 second, test it out, and looking pretty good. Oh, except that I made a little mistake. You can see at the end there's a little hitch, and that's because I added 1 too many animations. That's part of the jumping animation. I'm just gonna delete that 1 frame, and then drag in my last frame to replace it. All right, next up, let's make our jumping animation. And this is where things get just a little bit interesting. I'm gonna head into my sprite sheet here to show you exactly what I mean. Now, if we look at our jump animations, you can see that we've got a few, which is where he takes off and rises. And then we've got a apex sort of animation here, as well as a number of falling animations. Finally, we've got a few frames at the end for when he's landing. And we don't want to put these all in one animation or it will look funny, so we're going to turn these into 3 separate animations. So let's go ahead and create our first jumping animation. I'll actually call this one jump, as it's going to handle the trigger of the jump all the way up to the apex. This one's got a number of different frames. I'm going to include this one here, number 29, which seems like a good apex jump. We can drag those in. And this one is not a looping animation. In fact, we're just gonna play the animation through and then we're gonna sit on the last frame until he begins falling. So we don't need to copy the first frame over again or anything like that. At this point, we can just expand all of these frames so that they happen a little slower. Next, let's create our falling animation. If you're using Brullov's pack, this one goes from 30 to frame 34. We're gonna stop just before he actually hits the ground. As with our jump animation, this one doesn't loop and we'll just sit on the last frame until the next state is triggered, so we don't need to do anything special at the end of this one. Okay, let's create our landing animation now. This one has 3 frames as he falls, hits the ground, and then starts to rise back up again. Now here I make just a little mistake in the video. You do want to copy the final frame an extra time here, as this one is just gonna play through once and then transition to whatever our next state is, so idling or walking or whatever. At this point, we can hide our animation window as we won't be needing it for a little while. And then we want to go to our animator window in order to make the transitions for our states. You'll notice mine's empty. That's because I'm not clicked on the game object that holds the animation. So here we'll just click on our player's sprite, and there we go. You should be able to see all the animations that we just created. Now let's just drag falling and landing off to the side for now, as we'll handle those a little bit later. And then we can get our other states ready to go. Now we do want idle to be our default state when the game starts. If you right click, you can see that we actually can't set it as it already is. That said, if yours isn't currently orange, you can set it as the default. And then just gonna drag exit in here. Now, the way we're gonna handle this is by using parameters. So we're gonna add a new bool parameter here. The first one is just gonna be called isIdle. So let's make a transition now, going from entry to idle. And we're just gonna make it so that if idle's true, we enter, we'll then transition out, and we'll leave that animation anytime isIdle is false. That said, we also want to go in here and turn off exit time. We also don't need a transition duration. Let's add another bool parameter. We'll call this one isWalking, and then we'll just make a transition into it whenever isWalking is true. Then we'll add a transition to exit, set our exit time to 0 as well as our transition duration. And then for conditions, we'll just make it happen whenever isWalking is false. Finally, we'll create one more bool parameter called isJumping. I'm gonna move it up to the top so that it shows up as the first option when we're selecting. We'll then create our transition to enter, which will happen whenever isJumping is true, as well as a transition that will leave. This time around though, we're actually gonna leave exit time on, as I would like my jump animation to play in its entirety. And so we'll put a 1, meaning we want the whole thing to play. That said, we don't need any transition duration. Then we can come down to conditions and make sure it happens whenever jumping is false. So this is a state-based animation controller, and essentially just we can only ever be in one of these states, whichever one is true at any given time. So in our code, we're gonna wanna set it up so that we know which state we're in, and then we'll call the corresponding animation. All right, then let's get our code set up to talk to this animator. Now when we get in our player script, our first step is actually just gonna be to enable that talking to the animator. So let's create a public animator reference, and I'm just gonna call mine anim. And just to keep things organized, let's add a header here. These are all components, so we'll just add a component header. Next, let's come down to where all of our helper methods are. So apply gravity, check grounded, flip, and we're gonna add a new one, a void handle animations. So what we wanna do here is talk to our animator. So we'll type in anim, and we wanna set a bool. Let's start with our isIdle bool. Now, after this comma, we need to decide if we're setting it to true or false, but we don't know here, so we're gonna have to calculate it. So we'll just check to see if our move input's x value is less than 0.1, meaning it's a very small value, or 0 altogether, and that we're on the ground. If either of these things is false, it'll turn isIdle off, but if they are both met, it'll turn it true. That said, we need to account for if we're moving left. So what we're gonna do here is wrap our move input.x in brackets and apply a math function. We're gonna use a function called absolute. And all that does is it takes any negative number and converts it to a positive. We can then copy this line and paste it down below. We'll set this one to do the isWalking bool, and then we're just gonna do the inverse. So anytime our move input is greater than 0.1 and we're on the ground, we wanna play walking. So head up to update and let's make sure we're calling handle animation so that it's actually running while we play. Okay, let's click on our player and you can see that we need a reference to our anim. That is found on our sprite, so we can actually just drag the sprite in here and Unity will find out where the animator is. Now when we get in the game, you can see that our idle animation's playing, and when I move left to right, we get the walk animation. Excellent. If you're curious what's going on under the hood, we can drag our animator over to the side here and you can kind of just watch those transitions as you move around and see which bools are being triggered at any given time. We're now ready to handle our jump animations, and I got just a little carried away earlier making my transitions, because what we want to do for jump is be able to detect when we're rising, falling, and landing. To do this, we're going to need to make a sub-state machine. If we double click on that, you can see that it sends us to another animator screen, and what we can do here is just drag in the animations that will be part of this state machine. So jumping, falling, and landing. To make this nice and visually clear, I'm just going to put my exit down at the bottom and entry up at the top, and then we're just going to make transitions that go downward. So when we enter, we'll start a jump, but then we'll transition down to falling, transition to landing, and then actually we'll just move this base layer out of the way. It's the exit that I want at this point, so that once we've landed, we exit this jump state machine and we go back into our usual state handling for animations. We will use the isJumping bool in order to get into our jump or rising animation. That said, to go to falling, we're not going to use a bool. Instead, we'll create a float called y velocity. And for this transition, we'll just turn off exit time and duration. And we want to make it so that as soon as we start to fall, we play the falling animation. So that's going to be anytime our y velocity becomes less than, and let's just pick negative 0.1 here. Now we want the transition from falling to landing to happen when we hit the ground. So here we'll just create a bool called isGrounded. Now for that one, we want no exit time or duration, as we want to immediately play landing when we hit the ground. We'll also have that happen whenever isGrounded is true. Now for landing, we do want to play the entire animation every time. So here we'll leave exit time at 1, and we don't need any condition. We're just going to set it so as soon as it's done, we transition into whatever's next. Let's head up to our base layer now, and actually we can get rid of these 3 animations since they're now all in our substate machine. And now we'll just handle the transition going into jump. And here you can just click states jump. Then we can click on that specific transition to make sure that anytime isJumping is true, we head into the substate machine. Then we'll transition out, making it so anytime isJumping is false, we leave that substate machine. All right, now we just need to set those parameters values in our code. So let's go into player and head down to handle animations. Here we can tell our anim that we want to set the bool for isJumping. Remember that this is our rising animation, so we'll use our velocity here. So if our rigid body's linear velocity for the y is greater than, let's say, 0.1, we're on our way up, then it'll be true, and if it's not, it'll go to false. Also, we're going to set the bool for isGrounded, and here we'll just mirror the isGrounded variable we already have in this script. Finally, we're going to tell our anim that we want to set the float for our y velocity, and here we can just talk to our rigid body itself and grab its linear velocity on the y-axis. Alright, no setup necessary. When we get in the game, it should be working, though you'll notice my landing looks just a little bit funny. So I'm just going to click on my sprite and go into that landing animation. And right now it's quite short. I might just try stretching it out a little bit. There's the issue. I forgot to make this last frame last longer, so currently it's only playing for a single frame and then exiting. That's why we get that stutter. So probably don't actually need to make it this long. You can play around with the exact length and get what looks good for you, but adding that last frame here makes things look much better on the jump. All right, I hope you found this one helpful. In our next video, we're just gonna get rid of this drab looking world here by adding some tile mapping. Hope to see you in that video. Until then though, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.